December 19, 1944, the Ardennes forest, Belgium. The snow had not stopped for 3 days. It fell in slow, heavy sheets that swallowed the horizon and blurred the edges of every broken tree, every shattered foxhole. The wind carried the smell of cordite and pine, of diesel and fear. Somewhere in the distance, muffled beneath layers of white, a tank engine rumbled, deep and patient, like an animal that had caught a scent and was waiting to strike. Private James "Jim" Collier lay half buried in the snow beside his 57mm anti-tank gun. The weapon looked almost absurd now, a spindly, frost-coated thing crouched at the edge of a forest road. Its barrel pointed down a narrow valley cut through the trees, where the snow had been churned into gray slush by retreating American trucks the day before. To his left, a pine still burned where artillery had found it, crackling softly in the silence between distant impacts. This was the northern shoulder of the bulge, and Collier's gun was one of the few still facing east. He hadn't slept in nearly 40 hours. None of them had. Orders had been confused, contradictory, frantic. The Germans were supposed to be finished, exhausted. Everyone said the war would be over by Christmas. But now whole towns had fallen overnight. Communications were dead. Armor columns, Panzers, were breaking through the fog like ghosts of an older war. At dawn, Collier's platoon had been told to hold the road, as long as possible. The rest of the unit, what was left of it, was pulling back towards St. Vith. He hadn't asked how long as possible meant. The forest was quieter than it should have been. The usual chatter, the metallic click of ammo belts, the grumble of engines, was gone. Even the crows seemed to have fled. Only the whisper of the snow remained, endless and indifferent. Collier rubbed his hands together inside his gloves. The fabric was stiff, frozen solid. He could barely feel the steel trigger beneath his fingers. His loader, a kid named Foley, had gone back an hour ago to scavenge shells from an abandoned half-track. He wasn't sure if Foley was coming back. In the gray stillness, the world felt paused, like the breath before something irreversible. He looked up at the trees, heavy with snow, and thought of home. Nebraska. Wind over the cornfields. His mother's radio crackling with Glenn Miller. The way the horizon there stretched so far you could almost believe the world was simple. But it wasn't simple anymore. Not here. A faint vibration rippled through the ground, subtle at first, then growing, pulsing up through the soles of his boots. Collier froze. He pressed his ear to the gun shield. The tremor was rhythmic, mechanical. Tracks on frozen mud. He knew that sound. Everyone did. Panzers. He reached for his field glasses, wiped the snow from the lenses, and peered down the valley. The fog there shifted, a gray wall rolling slowly toward him, and through it, black silhouettes emerged. First 1. Then 3. Then 5. Mark IVs, maybe Panther tanks, hard to tell through the haze. Their barrels swept left and right as they advanced, their hulls glinting with frost and soot. Infantry followed in their wake, dark figures moving with them like shadows. Collier's heartbeat thudded against his ribs. His breath clouded in the cold. He whispered to no one, "They're coming." He checked his rangefinder. 900 meters. Too far for a clean shot. The gun's elevation was already locked in, the angle steep, facing down the frozen slope of the road. It was the only way to see through the clearing. The position had looked ridiculous on the map the day before, suicidal even, too exposed, too direct. But now, as the Panzers crawled forward, that angle, that suicidal angle, was the only line of fire left. He sighted down the barrel, his eye pressed against the scope. The reticle danced from vibration and adrenaline. He whispered a number to himself. Wind speed, distance, compensation. It was all instinct now. The kind of math soldiers learned through fear and repetition. At 700 meters, the first tank's outline sharpened. Snow flurried from its treads. The gun barrel leveled, searching for movement. Collier exhaled. He didn't know it yet, but that breath would mark the beginning of 3 hours that would never leave him. History remembers the grand offensives, the divisions, the names of generals, the shifting arrows on maps. It forgets the men who stayed behind the line. The ones who turned a field gun toward inevitability and decided, for reasons even they couldn't name, not to run. Collier squeezed the trigger. The anti-tank gun exploded with sound, a shattering, concussive thunder that shattered the frozen silence. The recoil slammed through his shoulder, nearly lifting him from the snow. The shell streaked downrange in a flash of white smoke and vanished into the fog. A heartbeat later, a metallic crack, then flame. The lead tank lurched, veered, and stopped. Its engine coughed black smoke into the sky. The German infantry scattered, their shouts carried thinly on the wind. Collier loaded another shell. His hands shook so badly he almost dropped it. 600 meters. Fire. 500. Fire. Another tank stalled. Another column halted. The forest echoed with his defiance. Within minutes, the return fire began. The Panzers answered with 75mm shells that tore the trees apart. Bark and splinters exploded in every direction. Collier ducked behind the shield, snow cascading around him. He could feel the shock waves in his chest, each one like a fist slamming through his ribs. He counted between blasts, 1, 2, 3, then rose again, sighting, firing, ducking. Somewhere to his right, a shell hit the ground close enough to throw him sideways. His ears rang. Blood trickled from one. He blinked, disoriented, and realized the gun had shifted. Its left wheel was buried in snow and ice, locked at an even steeper angle now. He could barely see the valley anymore, just flashes of fire, silhouettes in the fog. But he kept firing. By the second hour, his ammunition pile was nearly gone. The ground around him was cratered and smoking, littered with twisted metal and shards of bark. He couldn't feel his fingers. His coat was torn. His right hand bled from shrapnel. He thought of Foley, still gone, and of the others who'd withdrawn at dawn. He wondered if they'd made it. A new rumble came from the east, deeper, heavier. The ground trembled again. Through the smoke, a Tiger tank rolled into view. Its armor gleamed beneath the soot, massive and deliberate. Collier's chest tightened. The 57mm could barely dent that thing head-on. He wiped his eyes, sighted low. There was one place, one small seam beneath the turret ring, where the shot might do something. He waited. The Tiger advanced, gun swiveling toward him. He held his breath, steadying the reticle. The moment stretched thin, suspended between fear and calculation. Then fire. The shell struck the Tiger's lower hull, ricocheted, then vanished beneath it. A half-second later, the tank erupted in smoke. The turret jammed. The hatch blew open. Flames licked upward through the snow. Collier didn't cheer. He didn't move. He just stared, numb, at the burning machine. The forest around him hissed with melting frost. He would hold that position for 3 hours. Alone. 3 hours that would delay an entire German column long enough for Allied reinforcements to regroup west of St. Vith, a delay that historians would later describe as tactically insignificant. But the men who survived that night would remember it differently. They would remember the gunner who stayed. The man whose impossible angle, the one nobody believed would work, became the hinge point between annihilation and endurance. Collier didn't know any of that as he sat beside his gun in the falling snow, the barrel glowing faintly from heat, the air trembling with echoes. He just knew the valley was quiet again. And in that silence, beneath the drifting smoke and the endless snow, the war felt both infinite and very, very small. He didn't know it yet, but history had already taken his measure. In the chaos of the bulge, in that frozen pocket of defiance, a single man's decision had bent time, delaying death, altering maps, preserving lives he would never know. And somewhere, far behind the lines, a clerk would later write his name into a daily report, a line among thousands. Position held. Enemy armor delayed. No medal. No ceremony. Just the echo of a cannon in the snow. But sometimes that's how history begins. Not with orders. Not with strategy. With one man. One impossible shot. And a suicidal angle that refused to surrender. Escalation. The forest had gone quiet again, but it was not peace that settled over it. It was exhaustion, the stillness that follows thunder, when men listen not for what they hear, but for what they fear will come next. Private James Jim Collier crouched behind the gun, breath misting in short bursts. The snow around him was cratered and blackened, riddled with shell fragments. The barrel of the 57mm glowed faintly, a dull ember in the blue cold. Smoke hung low over the trees, curling in ghost-like ribbons that smelled of oil and iron. He had lost count of how many shells he had fired. 12? 14? Enough to break the rhythm of the German advance, but not to stop it. Somewhere beyond the fog, engines still growled, moving, regrouping. The lull was only an inhale before another strike. He looked down at the ammunition crate beside him. 3 rounds left. Each shell felt heavier now, as if it carried not metal but consequence. His gloves were stiff with blood and ice. He flexed his fingers. The movement sent a lance of pain through his forearm where a splinter of shrapnel had lodged. He ignored it. His world had narrowed to the gun, the snow, and the road below. Everything else felt distant, unreal. Somewhere behind the trees came a crunch of boots. Collier swung his rifle instinctively. A shape emerged through the smoke, a figure staggering, wrapped in frost-covered canvas. Foley? The loader nodded weakly, collapsing beside the gun. He was pale, his breath ragged. His coat was torn and a smear of blood ran down his cheek. In his arms he clutched a single box of shells scavenged from the wreck of a half-track. "Couldn't find more," Foley rasped. "They're all gone." Collier exhaled. 3 hours, he murmured. "Maybe less." Foley didn't answer. He simply sat there, trembling, eyes unfocused. The two men stared down the white road, a corridor of smoke and silence that stretched toward the unseen enemy. In the distance a single shot cracked, then another, then a burst. The Germans were probing again. Snow began to fall harder, thick flakes swirling like ash. The forest blurred. Collier felt time stretch, minutes turning to hours, each heartbeat drawn thin by anticipation. He thought of the retreating convoy miles west by now, and wondered if they even knew he was still here. Hold as long as possible. That was the order. He smiled bitterly. No one had said what possible meant. Confrontation. The next assault came without warning. A shell slammed into the ridge above them, throwing snow and rock in a white explosion. Foley screamed and ducked. Collier was already at the gun, swinging it toward the road. Through the clearing smoke, he saw movement, dark shapes advancing in a staggered line. Infantry this time, spreading out between the trees, their rifles glinting. Behind them, the low hulks of Panzer IVs crawled forward like black beetles. "Range 600, he shouted. Foley rammed a shell into the breach. The metallic click was swallowed by the wind. Collier sighted, adjusted for slope, and fired. The shot struck the lead tank squarely on the front glacis. The shell bounced harmlessly, a spark against armor. The tank answered with a blast that ripped through the treeline. The concussion threw them backward. Snow rained from the branches above. Foley coughed, clutching his chest. "We can't punch through that." Collier wiped the soot from his face. "Then we aim for what we can." He rotated the gun slightly, targeting the road bank. The next round exploded beneath the second tank, collapsing the snow and mud under its treads. The heavy machine slewed sideways, blocking the column. The German infantry scattered, diving for cover. Collier loaded again, teeth clenched. Another round screamed downrange, bursting amid the soldiers. The echo rolled through the valley, deep and final. 2 shells left. Foley shouted. The Germans regrouped quickly. A half-track swung around the wreck and began spraying the ridge with machine gun fire. Bullets hissed through the pines, chopping needles into mist. Collier ducked, heart pounding. Bark stung his face like gravel. He heard Foley cry out, a short, sharp sound. He turned. The loader had slumped against the gun's wheel, eyes wide, a dark bloom spreading across his parka. For a moment, the world contracted to silence. Collier reached for him, but Foley was already gone. The snow beneath him turned crimson, the color shocking against the white. Collier's mind went blank. Training, fear, grief, all collapsed into a single instinct. Keep firing. He dragged the last shell into place, hands shaking. The enemy was closer now, maybe 400 meters, figures moving between the trunks. A tank gun flared, missing high, the shell bursting somewhere behind him. He sighted, exhaled, and fired. The round struck the side of the immobilized tank, igniting its fuel. The explosion rolled through the valley, scattering men and flame. The blast wave knocked Collier backward into the snow. His vision swam. When he opened his eyes, the forest was an inferno of smoke and falling embers. The Germans were retreating into the fog, dragging their wounded. He was alone again, utterly, impossibly alone. He lay there for a long time, listening to the hiss of burning trees and the distant growl of engines withdrawing. His ears rang, his body ached. Every breath was a knife of cold air. He thought of Foley's last words, of how young the kid had been, how little of the war he'd seen. He thought of the men behind him, miles away, who would never know how close the Panzers had come. And he thought of home, a farmhouse under a big Nebraska sky, where snow was something beautiful, not a shroud. He pressed his forehead to the frozen earth and whispered, "Stay gone." But war rarely listens. Resolution. By the third hour, the world had become sound and motion without meaning. The artillery that rumbled in the distance was allied now, he could tell by the rhythm of it. Somewhere west, batteries had realigned, using the time his stand had bought them. The air shook with their answering fury. Collier forced himself to his feet. His legs were numb, his body leaden. The gun was out of ammunition, the barrel scorched and cracked. Around him lay the remnants of battle, shell casings half buried in snow, the still form of Foley, the blackened husk of a Panzer steaming in the cold. He checked his rifle. 5 rounds left. The Germans would come again, eventually. They always did. But for now there was only the wind whispering through the trees. He moved methodically, almost peacefully. He covered Foley's body with his spare blanket. He scraped snow over the bright metal of the gun, concealing its silhouette from the air. Then he sat back against the shield and waited. Minutes passed, then hours. The light shifted from gray to amber as the sun bled through the clouds. For the first time in days the snow stopped falling. Down the road, faint shapes appeared, tanks again, but these ones bore white stars. The growl of Shermans echoed between the trees. Collier pushed himself up, waving his arm weakly. A jeep followed the tanks, bouncing over the ruts. A sergeant leaned out, squinting through binoculars. When they reached him, the men stared. One of them whistled softly. The road below was littered with wreckage, 3 destroyed tanks, 2 more abandoned. Smoke curled from the valley like incense. "Who the hell did all this?" the sergeant asked. Collier just looked at the gun. "We did," he said, voice hoarse. The medic examined him, shaking his head. "You shouldn't be alive." Collier smiled faintly. Didn't have time to notice. They loaded him into the jeep. As they drove west, he looked back one last time at the ridge. The 57mm stood there alone, half buried, its barrel frozen mid-defiance. Snowflakes drifted around it like ash, erasing footprints, smoothing scars. He never returned to that place. Later, historians would argue about the importance of the skirmish near St. Vith. Some called it a localized delay. Others barely mentioned it at all. But among the armored units that survived those 3 days, the story passed quietly from one soldier to another. They spoke of the lone gunner who held a road against an army, whose impossible angle bought time for the line to reform. No one could agree on how many tanks he stopped or for how long. The numbers changed with every retelling. What didn't change was the feeling, the stubborn spark in the midst of collapse. In field reports, his name appeared once. Position maintained under heavy pressure. Enemy armor delayed approximately 3 hours. No medals were recorded, no photographs taken. Just that line buried among 1,000 others. Yet when winter ended and the forest thawed, tank crews passing that road would slow their vehicles. Some would look up toward the ridge, still blackened from fire, and nod quietly to themselves. They knew what had happened there. They could feel it in the shape of the silence. Collier spent the rest of the war repairing guns in the rear. His hearing never fully returned. His hands shook in the cold. He seldom spoke of Belgium or of the boy named Foley. But sometimes, on long nights, he would trace the shape of a 57mm shell in memory and wonder how such small things could alter the vast machinery of war. He never considered himself a hero. In his mind, he had only followed the order, to hold as long as possible. But history, indifferent yet precise, would note the ripple of his stand, the delay that allowed reinforcements to dig in at St. Vith, which slowed the German thrust toward Bastogne, which in turn bought time for Patton's counterattack. A chain of minutes that became hours, hours that became lives. And all of it began with a single gunner, half frozen in the snow, refusing to yield an angle everyone else had already written off as suicide. The forest remembers in silence. The road still cuts through the pines, narrow and unassuming, where the wind sounds like the distant growl of engines. Somewhere beneath that soil lies the echo of those 3 hours, the rhythm of shells, the heartbeat of defiance. And though his name faded from the rolls, the story endures wherever men stand their ground against impossible odds. Because sometimes courage is not the roar of victory. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to stay. Part 3, The Legacy. The Ardennes thawed slowly that spring. Beneath the melting snow, the forest revealed its scars, trees sheared in half by shrapnel, trenches now filled with muddy water, and the rusting remains of what once roared and burned. The snow that had hidden everything was gone, and with it went the illusion that war could ever be erased. Somewhere along a nameless ridge near St. Vith, the remnants of a 57mm anti-tank gun still leaned at a crooked angle. Its barrel pointed toward the valley where the German armor had once advanced, now silent and empty. Grass would grow there by summer, curling through the twisted steel. Birds would perch on the gun shield. The forest would forget the sound of it. But men remembered. The quiet return. Private James "Jim" Collier came home in the autumn of 1945, a year after that day in Belgium. The ship docked in New York under a gray sky, and bands played the same song they played for every returning unit. The crowd cheered. But Collier didn't feel like a victor. He stood among hundreds, carrying a duffel bag and a silence he couldn't shake. He took the train west, back to Nebraska, endless plains under open skies, where winter came not with artillery but with wind that hummed through the cornstalks. The town hadn't changed much. The feed store still stood beside the water tower. His mother still kept the radio on in the kitchen, though the music had changed. Neighbors shook his hand, called him hero, asked him if he'd seen the tanks up close. He would smile politely, say yes, and change the subject. He didn't speak of Foley. He didn't mention the road or the snow, or how 3 hours could last a lifetime. He took a job repairing farm equipment. Machines were simpler than people, their noise predictable, their damage visible. When the tractors sputtered or froze, he knew where to look, what to fix. There was comfort in that. On quiet evenings, he'd sit on the porch, watching the horizon burn gold at sunset. Sometimes, when the wind came from the north, he thought he heard the distant echo of engines, not the thunder of war but its memory carried faintly through time. Forgotten lines. The report of his stand near St. Vith was buried deep in the after-action files of the 2nd Armored Division. It was a single paragraph in a stack of thousands. Anti-tank position delayed enemy armor advance approximately 3 hours under heavy fire. Gunner remained at post after remainder of unit withdrew. No name. No citation. No coordinates. Just a statement of fact typed by a clerk who had never seen the forest or the snow. When the Army's historians compiled the official record of the Battle of the Bulge, the incident didn't make the cut. It was too small. Too localized. History, after all, tends to follow the generals, not the gunners. But among the men who had fought there, the tankers who regrouped west of St. Vith, the infantry who held Bastogne, the medics who patched up survivors, the story traveled quietly. They called it the suicidal angle. Nobody knew exactly where the phrase started. Some said it came from a forward observer who'd seen the flash of the lone gun firing uphill. Others swore it was coined later, over a mess tent table, by a Sherman crew who'd passed the wreckage weeks after. However it began, it spread. It became a kind of whispered legend. One of those stories that soldiers tell each other not to glorify the war, but to remind themselves that courage isn't measured by victory. It's measured by the decision to stay when leaving would be easier. The years between. Time moved differently after the war. The Europe that Collier had fought for rebuilt itself, stone by stone, town by town. New borders were drawn, new wars began elsewhere. The machines changed, the uniforms changed, but the questions never did. In 1961, Collier married a schoolteacher named Helen. They had no children, but the two of them filled their small home with laughter and radio music. On winter nights, when snow swept across the plains, she would catch him staring out the window, his expression distant. She never asked what he was remembering. He rarely attended reunions. The noise, the stories, the drinking, it all felt too loud. But in 1969, on the 25th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, he received a letter from an old comrade, Sergeant Thomas Rains, one of the men whose retreat his stand had covered. The letter was short. They say that road's a highway now. Trucks where tanks used to be. Drove it last year. Stopped on the ridge. Still feels like someone's watching. Thought you'd like to know. Collier folded the letter and kept it in a wooden box with his medals. A bronze star, a purple heart, and a small scrap of the 2nd Armored Division patch frayed at the edges. He never wrote back. But sometimes, late at night, he would take out the letter and read it again by lamplight, tracing the words with a trembling finger. The rediscovery. It wasn't until decades later, long after Collier's passing, that a young historian named Mark Devereux stumbled across the after-action report while digitizing archives at Fort Benning. The phrasing caught his eye. Position maintained, enemy armor delayed 3 hours. Devereux cross-referenced the date, the map coordinates, the unit logs. Slowly, the fragments began to align. A platoon assignment, a casualty list, a logistics note about expended anti-tank ammunition. And there it was, Private James R. Collier. No commendation, no detailed citation. Just a single signature confirming that the man had survived. Devereux became obsessed. He traveled to Belgium, hiked the ridge lines near St. Vith, interviewed locals who still remembered the thunder of 1944. One old farmer pointed toward a slope near the edge of the forest. There was smoke there for days, he said. After the war, no one would cut those trees. They said the ground had been brave once. When Devereux found the remnants of the gun, half buried in soil and moss, he stood in silence for a long time. He brushed away the dirt, revealing the corroded metal, the angle of the barrel still fixed on the valley below. He took a photograph. That image would later appear in a small exhibition titled, Unknown Courage, Forgotten Battles of the Bulge. Beneath it, the caption read simply, Private James Collier, U.S. 2nd Armored Division, held this position for 3 hours on December 19, 1944. Estimated enemy delay, 180 minutes. Estimated lives saved, incalculable. Visitors paused before that image longer than any other. Perhaps because it didn't show glory, only endurance. A frozen gun, a quiet forest, and the ghost of a man who stayed. Legacy. History rarely rewards silence. It prefers speeches, proclamations, and victory parades. But sometimes, silence is the only proof that something sacred occurred, something that words can only diminish. Collier never sought recognition, and perhaps that's why his story endures more deeply than most. Because it wasn't about medals or headlines. It was about duty, the old, stubborn kind that survives fear. Military historians would later argue that the 3-hour delay near St. Vith bought the Allies enough time to reposition artillery that blunted the German push toward Bastogne. That one small pocket of resistance shifted the timing of entire divisions. The difference between collapse and regrouping was measured not in days but in minutes. 3 hours. That was his gift to history. In memorials and documentaries, his name still doesn't appear beside the generals or the battles that defined the war. But among those who study courage, not the kind printed in books, but the kind found in frozen forests and lonely ridges, Collier has become a symbol. A symbol of the quiet man who stays behind. Of the ordinary soldier who becomes extraordinary not by choice, but by necessity. Of the belief that sometimes, a single act of defiance can echo farther than an army's advance. Epilogue. If you visit the Ardennes today, the forest has healed. The ridge where Collier fought is overgrown with fir and moss. Children play in the fields where tanks once burned. The road below hums with the sound of trucks and commuters, the everyday music of a world that forgot how close it came to vanishing. But if you step off the path just far enough to hear the wind through the trees, you might notice a small plaque fixed to a rock. It bears no rank, no unit insignia, no list of battles, only words. To the gunner who held the road. December 1944. Travelers stop there sometimes. They leave pebbles or poppies or folded notes. The forest stays quiet as it always has. And maybe, in that quiet, you can almost hear it. The echo of a cannon, the hiss of falling snow, the heartbeat of a man who did not run. Some men fight for glory. Some for orders. And some, like Collier, fight because the world needs a moment longer to catch its breath. History will not remember his face. It will not replay his heartbeat or the sound of his last shell. But it will remember the shape of what he did, the outline of defiance against the weight of inevitability. 3 hours on a frozen ridge. That was all. But sometimes all is enough to change everything. Because the path that saves the world is rarely the one marked on the map. It is the path chosen by a single man, cold, alone, and unyielding, who looks at the impossible and says quietly, "Not yet."